in their character.
Subir, to what extent is poor governance, faulty, over-bloated government administration and red tape exacerbating the problem?
Look, I mean, in my estimation, corruption happens when there is a lot of decision-making power concentrated within, a very few governmental servants. To me, it's not a question of a bloated bureaucracy as much as it is about the concentration of decision-making power within very few people. To my mind, and, to go back to the guest from Delhi, I think Venkatesh, his point, if you looked at the ways in which corruption has happened, the fact is, over the last 20-odd years, we have had a series of reforms of the state where supposedly the state has shrunk. You can look at, for example, even the numbers of bureaucrats who get recruited on an annual basis. That's actually gone down. So to my mind, this is not necessarily something about the size of government. I think it is something to do with the way in which political power is concentrated in few hands, and basically the ways in which a political culture about using public power for private gain has held over time. Now, Venkatesh talked about the fact that even if you went back a couple of thousand years, you would find descriptions of corruptions in Kautya's Arthashastra, and of course that is true. But to my mind, the modern state that has come into India via colonial rule and then later as well, you find very much the kind of structure of governance that we have today, the kind of local bureaucracy and so forth that we still have, and you will find very fine-grained detail as to why this kind of corruption happens. Among other things, there has been a major lack of any kind of a systematic institutional setup of sanctioning and monitoring corrupt bureaucrats. The right to information was mentioned, and of course that is very key. We will see how that plays out. And of course, over the last 1 month or 6 weeks, we've also seen a large upsurge of public interest in corruption, precisely because a person of a Gandhian political background sat on a hunger strike in Delhi. I think Venkatesh is also right about two different kinds of corruption, and it seems to me that to lump them together and to seek one explanation won't really do. We will have to think in terms of corruption operating along different logics at these two different levels.
Okay, we'll throw that back to Venkatesh in New Delhi in just a moment. But first, I want to bring in Nayanika Mathur in Cambridge, whose PhD was on the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which had a chapter written on it in the World Bank report. Is that right?
That's right, yes, it does. I just saw the report, and there is sort of a whole section devoted to the act.
Tell me about it.
Well, I just wanted to add to what Subir just said in terms of corruption. And I think the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act is a really interesting incident or a really interesting sort of piece of legislation which is primarily aimed at cutting down corruption in rural development schemes, particularly in public works programs, which have a long history of being probably the most corrupt anti-poverty schemes in India. So my fieldwork was all based around looking at the implementation of this act. And what I found actually corroborates quite well what Subir just said, which is that it's not a problem of a bloated bureaucracy. Rather, what I found in northern India was that the rural development infrastructure is extremely weak and shaky. There's a lot of work and a lot of sort of expectations of a very weak bureaucratic apparatus, which is extremely overworked and incapable of actually dealing with the kind of demands that this legislation has put on them. And so what has actually happened is that corruption, which is precisely as Subir just said, really arose from the fact that there were very few people who were controlling the funds, and till they actually let go of the funds would not move, and hence they had access to all sorts of state grants. This particular act has tried to stop that. And I think to a large extent, in conjunction with the Right to Information Act, it has been extremely successful. And that's why I think it's a very, very interesting case study in the rural development apparatus in India currently. Did you not get a sense, though, that there was any profiteering going on within it? Well, there definitely was profiteering going on, but what was interesting in this profiteering on the leakages, as the World Bank report puts it, is that due to the Right to Information Act and due to the heavy transparency and accountability clauses that have been put into this act, and I think it's important to point out that this is actually a legal piece, so it's a legislation as opposed to just a government scheme. The fact that this was a law created a lot of sort of anxiety amongst the lower level bureaucrats in northern India, and they were quite careful to treat it with as much care as possible. So they didn't, they were very careful with making sure the records are maintained properly, and that they were not actually flouting any of the regulations which were there in the Act. But there was still profiteering going on. There was still a lot of for instance, fictitious assets being created, a lot of fake documents being produced. But my contention really would be that it's much lower in this particular anti-poverty scheme than it has been in other anti-poverty schemes, particularly in public works programming in India.
So a lesser degree of corruption in the scheme that you studied, but in general, how do you feel, or what do you believe the solution is to making such programs suffer a lesser degree of corruption?
Well, I think there's no one particular magic bullet which will eradicate corruption from at least rural development programming. As we started out talking about it in the beginning of the program, it's absolutely systemic to the development bureaucracy in India. You literally cannot move one step or have anything take place without some sort of exchange of cash or some sort of transaction, some form of transaction, whether we call it a bribe or corruption or not, some form of transaction going on at the village level and the district level. I think what the takeaway from something like the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act is that you can curtail it by creating extremely sophisticated systems and sophisticated provisions within the schemes. You can also create it by making sure that there are strong punitive outcomes if a bureaucrat or a government functionary is caught red-handed, which creates a lot of fear in the system and makes people more cautious in the dealings with it. But I think a lot of it also has to do with things like these mechanisms of, say, social audits and empowering local communities to actually be able to question the actions of government officials, which up till quite recently they were not really able to do, and they were completely dependent on the beneficence of state officials coming in and giving them state lodges.
Venkatesh, I just want to ask you for your opinion on the provincial elections on May 14th, in which incumbent governments were swept away in 4 out of 5 states. To what extent do you think that shows that the burgeoning middle class in India is now consolidating as a potent political force, and what are its implications on what we're talking about here, poverty and corruption in India?
I'm afraid it's a little too premature to make those kinds of connections, because what needs to be considered is the voter turnout in most of these states. It was a phenomenal 70 to 85%, and I do not think that the responsibility for such a huge voter turnout can be placed at the doors of the Indian middle class. If we look at the Indian middle class, especially in urban areas, these are the people most of the time who do not go out and vote. It is people in large numbers who've turned out in rural areas who must be given the credit for changing governments here. And I think part of the credit also goes to the Election Commission, which has been successful in ensuring that booth capturing